Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
The president announcing the new tariffs on an additional $18 billion of Chinese imports, the announcement from the Rose Garden. With EVs in focus here, the rate increasing fourfold, as Bloomberg reported 2 days ago, 25% to 100. You've got lithium-ion EV batteries on here, solar panels doubling to 50%, tariffs on semiconductors doubling to 50% as well, all in effect by the year 2025. We're lucky to have the insight of Jeanne Sperling, the senior economic advisor to the president, who has advised many presidents on the economy. And he joins us now live here on Bloomberg. Jeanne, it's great to have you back. We just heard the president's remarks. Our listeners and viewers had a chance to listen and watch live. Is Joe Biden not a free markets guy anymore?
The president is a fair competition markets guy. That applies to how he looks at domestic market competition. He wants fair competition. That same principle applies internationally. We want nothing more than for countries like China, particularly China, to be a fair competitor where we are all playing by the same rules. We all know what happens, though, with China's economic strategy. They decide that instead of dealing with their own demand internally, that they're going to grow by exporting at all costs. And what that really means is exporting at unrealistically, overly subsidized costs that help their export numbers at the expense of American workers and American industry. And we've seen this movie before. We don't want to see it again. Now, the president is not coming at this just with a tariff approach. You know, from the campaign when he had his Build Back Better strategy, there's been a focus exactly on this, the strategic manufacturing jobs and industries of the future, ensuring that we both have a strategy to encourage investment. And it is remarkable to see over $800 billion of new private sector investment coming in these critical sectors. But we know what could throw that off is to be flooded with Chinese imports on those same areas. So this is a very strategic hit, but it is one that is designed to ensure and encourage and fair competition and make clear you're not going to do this incredible oversubsidization, at times trying to create more products than exist than there is demand in the whole world, and to do stuff that is so below market cost that it is your effort to grow at our expense.
Okay, you just said a lot there, Jeanne. I'm just trying to get a sense of what's motivating the president here, having seen the surgical approach on certain items as opposed to the across-the-board approach that we saw from the Trump administration. And I know that the administration has been trying to highlight that difference. But we didn't see anything go down. Right. And having seen all of the Trump tariffs remain in place, it sounds like he was on the right track.
There just couldn't be a greater difference. First of all, let's even just look at the results. Our trade deficit with China is right now the lowest it's been in a decade, lower than any of the 4 years under the previous administration. There was no strategy on to actually revive a semiconductor industry in the United States to compete for electric vehicle jobs or electric batteries. No strategy at all. Now what you've seen is the most aggressive legislation that is widely praised by the U.S. private sector and labor as well for encouraging more jobs here. So the president, as part of that integrated strategy that he has been working on every day since he's been here, is saying, we know what could disrupt our effort to increase supply and to make sure our companies have a chance to compete fairly and to sell our products domestically and externally is for China to engage, as they continue have in oversubsidization of key manufacturing sectors. This is not just our opinion. This is Europe's opinion. It is the opinion of even other major of the BRICS, others, well, you know which ones, that would that China is not playing by the rules and that they're seeking to export their way out of their challenges at the expense of others. So this is really part of that strategy. Now, going across the board in areas that are not essential, where we're not trying to build supply, where they could actually hurt production here or hurt families, is not part of that kind of strategic approach. And if we had done nothing till now, if there'd been no CHIPS Act, if there'd been no infrastructure bill, if there'd been no IRA bill to encourage electric vehicles and green manufacturing here, you could say, oh my God, this is just a one-part, off the cuff trade strategy. It's not. This has been part of an integrated strategy that has shown we can induce the private sector to create supply and manufacturing here. And manufacturing, as we know, punches above its weight in terms of private sector R&D, innovation, patents, and the spread of suppliers and strong supply chain that we saw how much we were hurt by not having during the pandemic, and we are not going to let be disrupted with unfair trade practices from China. If they want to play by the rules, bring it on. Let's compete.
Okay. I want to talk about briefly our relationship with China and the reaction. Jeanne Sperling, the president, said just now in the Rose Garden that China imports of U.S. goods, to your point on the trade balance, barely budged under the trade deal. But I see now the reaction from Beijing resolutely opposes the president's decision, sees the move as political manipulation. What's the drama for then if we weren't buying China EVs to begin with? And what does this mean for our relationship?
Well, I think it's very clear, and the president's been very clear, we're not trying to provoke a trade war. We're not trying to hurt relations. We're trying to have a sustainable, fair relationship where nobody seeks to strengthen their economy through unfair trade practices at the expense of others. But it really, we're not talking about a situation of little differences in small products. We're talking about almost a global consensus that China still operates on a model where they over-subsidize products to the extent sometimes where they have more capacity than there is global demand. At that point, you just have an organized strategic effort to flood the market with cheap goods that undercut those who are trying to play by the rules, who can't possibly compete because their costs are so low, not because of innovation, not because they actually have lower costs, but because of excessive market subsidization. So the president is, by having a targeted strategy, making clear this is not just an across-the-board slap at your face that would also hurt American consumers and raise their prices. We are looking at the areas in electric vehicles, in semiconductors, in electric batteries, where we have invested in strong supply and a strong supply chain in the United States and are seeking to have an industry that can compete long into the future, where both sides are playing realistically with what their costs are going forward. So I think it sends a strong message. It lets them know the areas where they need to play by the rules, or at least understand that we've seen this movie before of them crushing American communities and jobs with unfair subsidies, and we're not going to just watch that movie again. You have a president who's going to take strong action. This is part of a comprehensive strategy he's had for American manufacturing revival. The private sector has bought in. Labor has bought in. The American public has bought in. We're not going to sit by and let it be disrupted by China. If they want to play by the rules and have fair competition, then what the president is saying is bring it on. Let's have that.
Bring it on, says Jeanne Sperling. Jeanne, I'm glad you could join us today, and I appreciate that, having heard from the president on tariffs and now his economic advisor with the Griffith Observatory at his back. That's why you should be on YouTube. Jeanne, thank you. We're going to play this to the panel. Next hour, we'll have Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino with us. Also, June Grasso from Bloomberg Law and Congressman Brad Sherman, the Democrat from California, will join with a lot more to talk about here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Really, it's where New York is the center of the action. And it has been for the last almost month as Donald Trump has been on criminal trial in this hush money case that continues today. But we could be nearing the end game here as the prosecution's getting ready to finish up its questioning of Michael Cohen, his former attorney and fixer.
Yeah, the cross will be the news is what we're expecting here. Obviously, he hasn't said anything yet that we haven't really heard before.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I thought lawmakers were coming back to town today. The Speaker of the House is at the courthouse, along with several contenders for vice president. And we want to get into this with June Grasso, of course, the host of Bloomberg Law, who has a beautiful distillation every evening, 6 p.m. Eastern time on Bloomberg Radio about everything that happened over the course of the day. June, it's great to have you back from World Headquarters in New York. Is there any component of potential witness intimidation here? I realize anybody can come to the courthouse, right? But when you have some of the highest ranking elected officials, we saw Senator Rick Scott there today, the Speaker of the House. What's the testimony supposed to key off of here? What does Michael Cohen think when he looks up and sees all these people?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that happened after the mid-morning break. By the way, the Speaker was down there, I think, for about 45 minutes and left. Mm-hmm. But Michael Cohen, after the mid-morning break, was in the middle of his testimony, and according to our reporters who were there, a number of these Republican leaders walked into the courtroom at the time when Michael Cohen was testifying, so late, and they walked right down the middle of the court aisle and went to their seat.
That's right.
It is a little bit intimidating, I think, for witnesses who are on the stand. Now, Michael Cohen may be used to it, but other witnesses it would be intimidating for. Another interesting thing is the gag order. These lawmakers came because Donald Trump is looking to have his family's not there. His one of his sons is there on and off, but is looking to have this support from his backers. But did he tell them anything? Did he tell them anything about what to say about the witnesses? If so, that's a violation of the gag order technically. So, I mean, there are a lot of, it's very unusual, and if the jurors know who they are, I wonder how they view this. Maybe not in the way that Donald Trump wants them to view it as, oh, this is support, but more as, oh, this is intimidation and what's going on here. It's really unusual.
Well, it's an interesting point on the gag order, Jude, because, of course, that bars Trump from speaking about certain witnesses, including Michael Cohen, but also members of the judge's family, including his daughter. And the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, specifically called out Judge Merchan's daughter and her ties to Democratic fundraising today, which I thought was interesting. When it comes to the actual testimony, though, that we are hearing from Michael Cohen and the questions we have gotten from the prosecution, to what extent is their line of questioning today basically trying to set up to hedge against what could come in the cross-examination when the defense gets its turn?
Well, that's how they ended the direct examination. The last thing they did was go through, Michael Cohen's various convictions and the lies that he told to banks and Congress, et cetera. And the final question was one of those, do you regret this? And apparently his voice choked up and he talked about regretting all he'd done and he lost his moral compass, and they ended on that. So they did try to sort of what they call it, take the sting out of what's definitely coming up on the cross-examination. But, he is a troublesome really flawed star witness, because he not only is saying that, he lied about at the times before Congress, but he's also on the stand saying, and they're asking him, what about this document? Is that false? Yes. Did you lie about that? Yes. So his testimony itself is filled with, I lied, but now you believe me. And so the prosecution is hoping that the backup that they have with the documents is going to make the jury comfortable believing him. I think one of the best documents they've had so far was introduced yesterday afternoon, and it was a slip from the bank saying that he had paid the $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer, and there was handwriting on it from Weisselberg, the CFO, and it was the formula for how he was going to be paid. And the interesting thing was that it took account for the fact that, and this is a little mathematical, I'm not going to get too mathematical, but if this is a payment for his services, then it would be taxed. If it was a payment reimbursement, it wouldn't be taxed. So they figured out what the taxes would be. They added another 50% onto it so that the taxes would be taken care of, and they grossed it up, is the term that they use. So that's sort of interesting, and I think very supportive of the fact that, Weisselberg did the formula here, and we've heard time and time again that Trump knew, every dime that went out in his company. So I thought that was really good testimony.
All right, June Grasso, the host of Bloomberg Law, breaking down another day of dramatic testimony in the Trump hush money case in New York. The trial, that is. And of course, it's not yet over. They are just on lunch break right now. June, thank you so much. And of course, Joe, well, Donald Trump, as he campaigns for the presidency, wants to be elected in November, of course, has these legal headaches to deal with. President Biden has many headaches as well, that's not in the legal arena, but certainly in terms of geopolitics, as he has faced a lot of criticism over his handling of Israel and its conflict with Hamas, most recently the decision to withhold sending large bombs to Israel because of concern over how they could be used in Rafah.
Yeah, count the ways. I mean, from geopolitics to border politics to the economy, this is a candidate and a president spinning a lot of plates right now, as we saw him try to employ the Rose Garden strategy earlier, announcing some new tariffs on China. But fascinating to see. They're spinning so many plates that we forget some of them sometimes, Kailey, as the Secretary of State touches down in Kyiv. With all the shuttle diplomacy throughout the Middle East, Ukraine is in the focus at the White House today.
Yeah, the first time we've seen the secretary there since the actual supplemental aid package passed Congress after months and months of efforts. Finally, Ukraine getting more military assistance it needed from the U.S. The question is, how quickly does it make a difference in that conflict, especially when we're seeing another hot conflict in the Middle East as well? And it's on that note we want to turn now to Mara Rudman. She is the University of Virginia professor at the Miller Center. She's also former State Department Deputy Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and former Deputy National Security Advisor. Professor, thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. If we could first begin in the Middle East, as the Prime Minister of Qatar was actually speaking at the Qatar Economic Forum that Bloomberg is helping host earlier today, suggesting that right now ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas are essentially at a stalemate. If it doesn't happen in the near immediate future, is it ever going to?
Well, yes, the hope will continue and the work must continue on getting to a pause in the fighting, in getting to Israel to focus more strategically on their goals and the best ability to defend themselves, and getting hostages out and humanitarian aid in. These are all the reasons why it's really critical to maximize pressure and focus on getting to a ceasefire agreement.
So with that said, how much would a ceasefire depend on hostages being released, knowing that not everyone believes they are all alive? And we keep hearing reports that Hamas cannot identify the location of all of the hostages with whom they are dealing. How does this play out in the end?
So part of a ceasefire is very much dependent on getting hostages out. And that is, sadly at this point, whether it's bodies or whoever is remaining alive. The hostages have obviously been held under horrific circumstances or taken into Gaza under even more horrific circumstances. And it is critical that they be returned, they or sadly their bodies. In terms of what Hamas knows or doesn't know about where they are, that was certainly brought out early in the immediate post-effects of October 7th, given the number of different groups associated with Hamas that had a role in taking those hostages in. I think it has less credibility at this point, since it is so clear that Yahya Sinwar, who is the military commander of Hamas in Gaza, who orchestrated this entire October 7th attack and the aftermath, is a guy who is very much in control. So I think it begs credibility at this point that they don't know exactly where most, if not all, of the hostages are.
It's interesting, and I wonder if any of them may be in Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians had sought refuge, and where the U.S. policy is really coming to most direct conflict, perhaps, with what Israel would like to do, is the U.S. would not like to see a major ground invasion of Rafah, and yet Israel is already making incremental moves in that city in particular. The UN has said within the last 24 hours that some 450,000 civilians have already fled Rafah in the last week. Do they have anywhere safe to go? For all of the administration saying we just want to make sure there is a plan in place to protect civilian life in Rafah while Israel is trying to achieve its objectives of eradicating Hamas, getting those last remaining battalions there taken care of. I just wonder if it really is possible for Israel to do both.
Well, Kailey, the question you raised is a question being raised and it has been continuously raised by the U.S. administration at the most senior levels, and also reportedly by Israel's military leaders, who are increasingly coming out more publicly and questioning the ways in which Prime Minister Netanyahu has been directing this effort. So there's a concern certainly about where the hostages are. It is almost certain that they're in tunnels, that many tunnels that are deep under Gaza. And so whether they're in Rafah or in Khan Yunis, they're almost certainly surrounding and being used as human shields for Yahya Sinwar, the military commander of Hamas, and probably for many other Hamas fighters. To be clear, much of Hamas, the military units, are deep underground in these tunnels. Hamas does not allow the many Palestinian innocents that privilege. In other words, they are using Palestinian innocents very much as fodder. In a horrible way. And those folks are all on the ground. And as you say, there are no real safe places in Gaza at this point. And that's part of the point that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made really clearly just recently, in saying that the United States has yet to see any kind of credible plan by Israel on how to protect Palestinians above ground in Gaza.
Mara, I know you were in Ukraine just last month, in Kyiv, where the Secretary of State is today. Knowing that the money's been passed, the weapons are on the way, what was the purpose of this visit by Antony Blinken, if not only to send a message to Vladimir Putin?
So, in fact, I think that Secretary Blinken was sending a message both to Vladimir Putin and, frankly, to the people of Ukraine as well. He and President Zelensky have a very good and strong relationship. Ukrainians have been quite concerned about the degree of U.S. continued commitment to their very real fight, to their struggle against Russia, given how long it has taken the United States, frankly, because of skirmishes within the Republican Party in Congress, how long it had taken the United States to get that vitally needed assistance to Ukraine. So I believe what Tony Blinken was doing was sending a message, was in a very real way showing the people of Ukraine, as well as President Zelensky, the degree of U.S. commitment, and offering some reassurance, as Jake Sullivan did on his visit back, I believe, in the end of March, that U.S. aid, some of it has arrived, more is coming, and it will very much help Ukraine in the very significant challenges they are facing now from Russia.
And finally, Mara, in our final minute with you, obviously, while the U.S. has provided aid to Ukraine, the U.S. also has put essentially limits on what it would like Ukraine to do with that aid, including not doing anything offensively into Russian territory. For Ukraine to win this war, are we going to have to see a tweak on the margin to administration policy on that front too?
Kailey, I think that's a very good way of describing it in terms of the language you just used about a tweak on the margins. I do think it's important that the United States have the most expansive possible view of allowing Ukraine to fight this fight. The United States is quite fortunate that the United States and Americans are not on the ground having to defend against Russia. We need to make sure that Ukraine has every ability to do so and to prevent the further spread of Russian aggression in Europe.
Mara, it's great to have you, and we appreciate the time today on Balance of Power. Mara Rudman, University of Virginia professor, former State Department Deputy Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, spent a good deal of time in the national security space, and your insights are important to us. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, we have to play this to the panel. We haven't heard from Rick and Jeanne yet, and we have a lot to cover today from both spheres in politics and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue.
Indeed, and up in New York, where we're seeing the Veep stakes take things on the road all the way to New York City outside the courthouse.
The optics are amazing today, and we'll have more on all of this next with our signature panel on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where we have had our eyes on New York on the ongoing hush money trial of former President Donald Trump. But we have another legal development that impacts potentially the current president, or at least his family, specifically his son, Hunter Biden. According to the Associated Press, a judge has rejected Hunter Biden's bid to delay his federal gun trial. That trial is now going to begin, Joe, next month in Delaware. Again, this is the son of the president. It's not the president himself, but still this could be a headache for Joe Biden as he campaigns for re-election. The legal issues certainly do not begin and end with the Republican presumptive nominee.
Well, that's for sure. And obviously the president has had to deal with this more than once, although at the same time we've seen efforts in Congress to try to vilify what they refer to as the Biden crime family kind of fall flat to the point where it doesn't really appear that the impeachment proceeding or the impeachment inquiry that could lead to a proceeding is underway any longer. There's a lot of gray there right now with James Comer and his oversight committee. Yeah,
so I guess we'll have to wait and see if we get developments out of Congress or any further announcements in regarding impeachment from the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. But he wasn't actually even on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. this morning. He was up in New York at the courthouse where Donald Trump is today. And this is what the speaker had to say outside.
I'm an attorney. I'm a former litigator myself. I am disgusted by what is happening here. What is being done here to our entire system of justice overall. The people are losing faith right now in this country, in our institutions.
Let's get into it with our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino join us on Balance of Power for their take on this and a few other stories happening today. Great to see both of you here. Rick, these are politically motivated trials and they are a disgrace, said the Speaker of the House. You can weigh in on the value of this entourage, but I guess the point here is he can say things Donald Trump cannot. Is this a good strategy?
Well, it certainly improves upon the strategy. I mean, when this trial got started, Donald Trump was basically alone in that courtroom, and very few people, his family, coming in every now and then. He started complaining about that, and I think limited himself to what he was starting to say about judges and whatnot to not trigger any more fines for contempt. So, now it seems like this is all part of a choreographed campaign to interview vice presidential candidates, to show party unity around Donald Trump, and to undermine the legal process that's going on in New York. I came up today to New York just to see if I could get on the list of VP candidates. And I guess that's probably not going to happen, but the reality is it's going to be crowded up here.
Indeed. Well, of the VP candidates who are at the courthouse alongside Mike Johnson today, we're talking specifically about North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, Vivek Ramaswamy, a former presidential candidate himself who was running against Trump at one point, and Florida Congressman Byron Donalds, who it's also been floated. But Mike Johnson hasn't, Jeanne. He's not in the running for Veep. Why did he feel the need to go? Rick was just speaking to the strategy here for Donald Trump. What's the strategy for Mike Johnson?
He's got to stay very close to Donald Trump because that's why he has his job, after all. That's why Donald Trump decided not to support Marjorie Taylor Greene for the moment in her quest to vacate him. But I have to tell you, I find this all a little depressing and sad for Donald Trump. I mean, you can't get your family there to show you some love when you're facing 34 felony counts, well, except for his son. And so you're getting what? All of these people who are only there because they want to maintain their positions or get their positions. It's very, very strange. And, don't these people have anything else to do besides sit in a New York courtroom all day? The Speaker of the House, sitting senators in the U.S. And, I would think they might be a little careful about calling out a young woman. We've heard Mike Johnson, we've heard J.D. Vance attacking the judge's daughter because she has a job. I mean, folks, look back at what happened to Rudy Giuliani and others when they attacked Ruby Freeman and her daughter. $148 million later, you think they'd be very careful of this, but nothing can get between any of them and Trump, apparently, at this point.
Well, while we're talking about the Veep stakes here, I'm curious to get both of your reaction to what we heard from Ken Griffin, Citadel, of course, talking about the wait to see who wins the Veep stakes. He was asked if he had donated to the campaign yet. Here's what he said.
I have not. Will you? I'm going to wait to see who he picks as his VP candidate.
Is there anyone whom you'd like to see him pick as his VP candidate?
I don't. This is, again, like poking the bear. Not sure which way my recommendation goes in terms of helping that person's prospects.
So he doesn't want to thumb the scale on this one, I guess, Rick. But in a serious world, I don't mean to make you smirk here, but taking a look at those folks who were actually at the courthouse and some of the others who have been to fundraisers in Palm Beach recently, do any of them appeal more to the investment crowd?
Well, for sure. And I think this is what I'm hearing within the Republican donor community from people like Ken Griffin, is I can see toward supporting Donald Trump, those who haven't so far, and there are a lot, if he picks the right vice president. Obviously, Doug Burgum's a good example of that. To a lesser extent, J.D. Vance. I've heard the Virginia governor, Youngkin, mention many times how much more comfortable we would be if he had someone like Youngkin on his VP selection. So I do think those kind of folks matter. And I think that's an advantage for Tim Scott. He's a ranking leader on the banking committee in the United States Senate. He's had a lot of support from Wall Street and the investment community. And so I think these things are going to matter to that group as to whether or not they put their thumb on the scale, as you say. And look, I mean, somebody like Ken Griffin, he's already given $60 million this cycle. I mean, he can really make a difference if they get the right candidate on that ticket.
Well, and where Ken Griffin is putting a lot of his money after he initially had donated to Nikki Haley, obviously hasn't donated to Donald Trump yet, is down ballot races. Jeanne, in fact, that's where a lot of mega donors have shifted their focus, who have been reluctant to support Donald Trump, including the Koch network, for example, which was also backing Nikki Haley, now is looking down ballot. And on that note, we do have a pretty important primary that could help decide the composition of the United States Senate potentially in Maryland. Larry Hogan, the very popular former governor of Maryland, the Republican, is going to be up against either David Trone or Angela Alsobrooks, depending on who wins that Democratic primary today. Could potentially, Jeanne, the Democrat, decide whether or not Republicans flip that seat, and Larry Hogan could get a seat for Maryland, add West Virginia to that? The Senate's gone, right?
It absolutely is. And of course, Larry Hogan, incredibly popular, and interestingly, not somebody who would probably be visiting the trial with Donald Trump, because he has been a big Trump critic. But I think we are seeing in some of these down ballot races, unlike in the last midterm, Republicans are willing to go with and choose candidates who have a better shot of winning, not just because of their fealty to Donald Trump. And Larry Hogan's a perfect example of that. On the Democratic side, it's a fascinating primary because Alsobrooks has the support of basically the establishment in Maryland up and down the ballot. But, Trone has spent so much money, as I'm sure you know, Kailey, living in that area. You can't go to the DC, Virginia, Maryland area and not see his ads. And so it's going to be interesting to see where Democrats go on that. Does the establishment win? You've got, a woman with a lot of support in that area, and you've got somebody who can spend his own money and basically making the case. Do you want to spend the party's money? We need it elsewhere. Let me spend mine. And so it's going to be fascinating to see what happens tonight.
Well, so Rick Davis, what is worth more? The endorsements of Wes Moore, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Steny Hoyer, or $60 million in your personal bank account?
We're going to find out tonight, because that's exactly what we're looking at in that Democratic primary. But I hate to burst their bubble. All of that may be for naught, because when I see the current polling, Larry Hogan is crushing him, almost a 20-point race. And I know that the popular thing is to say, oh, well, people vote differently for governor than they do for the Senate. And generally speaking, I'd say that's probably the case. And they'd have to be very different in this case. But Larry Hogan left office with a 77% approval rating. Let's not underestimate the fact that it almost, if you look at the polling today, is irrelevant who wins this primary tonight. It's going to be a very stiff undertaking for Democrats to hold that seat.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our signature political panel, joining us on this primary day. Thank you so much. And Joe, again, we almost forget that there's still ongoing primaries because we have our presumptive Republican and Democratic nominee for president, but there still are a lot of important ones that are for other races that we still have to pay attention to.
This is a big one in Maryland. To your point, you get this in West Virginia behind you tonight, and we could have this decided already. We'll find out together.
Yeah, indeed.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thanks for joining on the fastest show in politics alongside Kailey Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu. As we were just discussing, Kailey, the political challenges that Israel policy has brought the Biden campaign and the Biden White House, for that matter. It's been a problem for a lot of progressive Democrats, and the withholding of at least one, maybe two shipments of weapons upset a lot of Republicans on this matter, which will point our listeners and viewers to House Resolution 1219, a messaging bill, but an important one today, Kailey, that we'll see a vote tomorrow, it looks like.
Yep, that is when the House is set to vote on this. This is essentially a bill that would force President Biden to send withheld weapons to Israel. Remember that this weapons withholding that we've seen the administration take here is offensive weapons, large bombs that they have not yet sent, just paused for now because of concern over how they could be used in Rafah. Does not actually have anything to do with the supplemental funding that Congress passed. That was mostly defensive weapons, including things that would restock the Iron Dome missile defense system. But there has been a lot of consternation about this decision from the administration, and now there's going to be an attempt to put members of the House on the record choosing a side on this. And one of them who is going to have to do so is joining us now. Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman of California is with us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Congressman, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power. Will you be voting yes to this bill tomorrow?
I will probably vote no. I wish the Republicans had worked with Democrats on a bipartisan resolution that we could vote yes on, because we should be shipping those weapons. And much more important than the bombs that are getting all the discussion is the JDAMs. Those are kits that turn smart bombs, dumb bombs, into smart bombs. And to criticize Israel for not acting with precision while depriving them of the kits that make the bombs act precisely is just the wrong message. The problem with the Republican resolution is that it not only deals with these immediate concerns, but makes Israel permanently exempt from the Leahy review. That's a review to see whether the countries receiving our weapons are using them according to international standards and our standards. Israel passes that review. Israel is doing a better job, and it's a very difficult job, but a better job than any other military in waging urban warfare while seeking to minimize civilian casualties. Now, it's a very hard thing to do, and there have been civilian casualties. But to exempt Israel permanently from the standard is like me going to the high school and telling them, don't make my kids take the test. No, my kids are smart. I want them to take the test, and I know they're going to pass. And what we should do is have this standard apply and show that Israel is in fact complying with international law and our own standards. To exempt them feeds into this worldwide narrative that Israel is not seeking to minimize civilian casualties. Now, given that Hamas, their whole strategy is to surround themselves with as many women and children as possible while firing rockets at Israel, that makes it difficult on Israel. But that is part of the standard that's used to review, and Israel should not be exempt. Israel, though, however, passes the standards.
The report by the State Department, Congressman, thanks for being with us today, that Antony Blinken submitted last week does bring some concerns, accusing Israeli forces of potentially violating international humanitarian law. Have you told the president how you feel about this?
I have told the State Department that I don't think that they phrased things correctly in that report. But the fact is that potentially violate, everybody potentially might have violated. What in the hell does that mean? But the fact is that Israel not only complies with the standards, but they have a system for reviewing their own military. Look, in Vietnam, we didn't comply with all the standards, but Lieutenant Kailey went to prison because we identified and we had a system for reviewing the actions of our individual soldiers. Israel has that as well. They're conducting a number of investigations. So according to Israel, it is possible that some of their soldiers acted wrongfully. And according to America, it is possible that some Israeli soldiers have acted wrongfully. But that the Leahy standard isn't that you cut off weapons to an ally because some soldier may have acted wrongfully. You, in fact, you want to see the top echelons of any allied government implementing standards to hold their soldiers accountable. Israel does that. And that's why the ratio of civilian to terrorist deaths in Gaza is actually considerably better than what we saw in Mosul and Fallujah. And we've got a very moral and very capable military force. And that's what we used in Iraq.
Well, Congressman, it's great to hear your perspective on the issue of Israel's ongoing war with Hamas, given your seat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But you also have a seat on another committee, which we'll be focusing on here at Bloomberg tomorrow. House Financial Services will have the prudential regulators in front of you and your colleagues in a hearing. I'm sure there will be some questions for Michael Barr of the Fed over the Basel III endgame and what that's looking like. But I'm imagining, especially your Republican colleagues, will have some very tough questions for Marty Grunberg of the FDIC after that scathing third-party report came out about the workplace culture at the FDIC. There have been a lot of calls, sir, for the chair to resign. Would that at least go some distance to solving what is described as a deep-rooted problem?
I think we have to deal with the atmosphere at FDIC. They have over 6,000 employees, and they deserve a better atmosphere. But as important as those 6,000 employees are, every American has a stake in whether these Basel III regulations serve our economy well. If we go too far one way, banks won't have the sufficient capital, and we'll see a need, or at least a claim need, for bailouts in the future. But if we go too far the other way, banks won't lend, particularly to small business. They'll just invest in treasury bills, and that will leave small business without a way to get the funds that they need. In addition, there are individual problems with the proposed regulations. Provisions that don't treat appropriately energy efficiency standards and clean energy tax credits, which are an asset the bank should get credit for. There is a language in Basel III that will not give credit for mortgage insurance. So banks will be reluctant to lend to first-time home buyers, even if they have mortgage insurance that, as a practical matter, insulates the bank from risk. We've got a host of other problems where these regulations seem to push the banks toward investing in bonds on Wall Street and push them away from making loans to local businesses on Main Street. That is the exact opposite of what we need. It's local businesses that need the capital. Wall Street's doing a fine job providing money to publicly traded corporations.
Congressman, it's great to have you back. Brad Sherman, the Democrat from California, walking us through a couple of issues today. Thanks for joining us today on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We heard from the president a short time ago addressing the nation from the Rose Garden, where he made good on expectations to raise tariffs on certain China imports. If you've been with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio or on the terminal, you saw this coming. EVs, solar panels, batteries, semiconductors, all on the list. Kailey, this is market-moving stuff coming from the White House today, and I guess the president's trying to encroach on one of Donald Trump's lanes here.
Yeah, Donald Trump, of course, has proposed something much more sweeping, 60% blanket tariffs on every import coming from China, whereas the administration here is perhaps being more targeted. The question, Joe, is to what extent are these symbolic and to what extent will they actually have an impact, considering existing tariffs are already in place for a number of these goods, essentially boxing Chinese products out of the U.S. market already. This is the type of thing we need Jenny Welch to help us with. That's why she's at Bloomberg. Of course, geo-economist in our geopolitical division at Bloomberg Economics. It's great to see you, Jenny. Welcome back. This is something that does smack of Donald Trump, but the president also said in the Rose Garden that we weren't really getting any imports from China out of our trade deals anyways. Does this change anything?
So I think what this will change is it's particularly these specific sectors. As you noted, this is a very targeted move to target the industries that President Biden has made a lot of investments in and protect those investments so that they can be the industries of the future, as he calls them. In terms of the macro impact on U.S.-China trade, it's pretty small. The macro impact on China's economy is also small. But the signal it sends about Washington's interest and commitment to competing in these industries is major for Beijing. Well, so what signal will Beijing send in response? Already, their Ministry of Commerce has essentially said that they are not in favor of this. They view it as a political move. Should we expect retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods going to China in response? Our expectation is that Beijing's response is likely to be more in the symbolic category of things for a few reasons. One, again, the impact on China's economy and on U.S.-China trade is relatively targeted. It's relatively modest. Second, China's probably aware of the fact that the EU is watching all of this very closely, and it could factor into the EU's own pending decisions about how it approaches Chinese goods like EVs. And third, retaliation bears some risk and harm to China and China's economy. We saw during the original trade war that China actually downshifted some of its retaliatory tariffs to avoid further harm to China's economy, which is now facing even greater headwinds than it was back then.
Political manipulation, I think, is how Beijing described this when it was at least anticipated. Jenny, then what's the end result with our relationship, having just seen Antony Blinken and Janet Yellen in Beijing?
Well, on those trips, both Secretary Yellen and Secretary Blinken pretty clearly signaled that the United States was concerned about overcapacity in several of these sectors, right? Yeah. I think this has been a pretty well-telegraphed move that Beijing's been expecting. Well telegraphed indeed, and symbolic, as we've discussed, in large part, at least for some of these industries, like electric vehicles, for example. You can't really buy a lot of Chinese-made EVs in the U.S. as it is. For some of the other sectors, though, in which we've seen the tariffs go into place, including a 25% tariff now on critical minerals, things like batteries and the stuff that goes into them. The U.S. needs these, right, to power a greener energy future, and we're still heavily reliant on China for those things. Is this going to backfire to some extent? So I think that's the exact reason the Biden administration took these steps, is they're concerned about China's dominance of these supply chains and U.S. reliance on them. In particular, as you mentioned, critical minerals, batteries. We also get the vast majority of our lithium-ion batteries, which are critical to EVs and other clean energy products, from China. That's part of the reason why the administration is phasing some of these tariffs in. Some of them will come into play, like EVs, this year after the initial comment period, but several are for 2025, 2026 to allow the market to adjust them. And it's to create that space for more resilient, sort of diversified supply chains in these sectors.
The idea of this as a tacit endorsement of the Trump tariffs is something I brought to Jeanne Sperling, who joined us earlier in the broadcast, one of the president's economic advisors, and he wasn't having any part of that. We do need to acknowledge all the Trump tariffs have stayed in place. They didn't bring down any of them.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And this is a process that folks should know began several years ago.
Yes.
It took a long time for it to come to culmination. It's an opportunity for Biden to put his personal stamp on the U.S. trade approach to China and underscore what his priorities are and protect his investments. But yes, it reflects continuity in terms of concerns about the U.S.-China trade imbalance that former President Trump also shares.
Well, and that President Biden called out the Trump administration policy when he was actually in the Oval Office, as well as the policy that Trump said he would pursue if he gets to go back there again as president, this idea of 60% blanket tariffs. He said that that would raise costs by a certain dollar amount for American consumers, essentially be inflationary. Will these tariffs, though, announced today also be inflationary, or are we likely not to really feel the economic impact?
I think for these tariffs, no, it's a more modest impact. For many of these goods, again, with the exception of batteries and critical minerals, where we do import a lot from China, we're actually not getting very much from them this phase. But yes, if former President Trump were to be reelected and follow through on this pledge to enact 60% tariffs on all Chinese goods, that would have a significant impact on U.S.-China trade, bring it down to almost zero, depending on the timeline in which he does that, could be quite inflationary.
All right, Jennifer Welch, Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst. This is the very definition of geoeconomics. Thank you so much for joining us here in Washington.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.